Howdy, howdy, Sue Devil here, and welcome to my Dwarf faction review for multiplayer for beginners. This is really a review for those people that are interested in multiplayer, not so sure about it, might want to play the Dwarfs, and just want some helpful information or tips that can help them do better in multiplayer as they're starting out. So I'll go over a few things, basic things about the Dwarfs, and I'll go through some multiplayer tips at the end, and I will review their army and each segment of the Dwarf army to help you with your builds if you're just starting out. So the very first thing to know about the Daoi, as they're called, the Dwarfs, is that they are a very unique faction in that they're the only faction in the game that don't have magic or cavalry. So the Dwarfs do, just by their very nature, tend to be very defensive. They have very poor mobility, but they have great leadership, awesome artillery, excellent range selection. They're very tanky all around. They do have no monsters, and they do have very limited flyers. So there's basically, the gameplay, again, is defensive in general, but you can make good Dwarf rush armies if you choose to. So going over the Dwarf units, I'll start with the Lords, and then we'll just go down and go through each segment by segment to talk about the Daoi. Now, the Dwarf Lords you have a reasonable selection of the Lords you can bring in their basic Lord, your Rune Lord, Belegar Ironhammer, Ungrim Iron Fist, Grombrindle the White Dwarf, and Thorgrim Grudgebearer the High King himself. Now, there's no flyers in the bunch, so a lot of factions have Lords they can put on dragons or griffins or these types of things and put them in the air, but the Dwarfs don't have that option. When we're looking at the Lords, if you're starting out, the two most competitive Lords are really your Rune Lord, very specifically because he's quite inexpensive, and if you strip him down, he can be quite cheap at 800, but if you put him on his mount, he actually gets an extra 15% magic resistance, and the Dwarfs naturally have a 40% magic resistance. So with that extra, or naturally have 25%, so with that extra 15% on his Anvil of Doom, you get extra magic resistance, so you can be really robust against magic. And the very best ability is the Master Rune of Wrath and Rune. You can cast that on units that are up to 150 meters away. It does good damage to big infantry, like against Chosen or Great Swords or these types of things. It's not real great against single targets like Lords, but it does reduce their speed by 48% and lasts for 36 seconds, so it's a very strong ability. You put him on his Anvil of Doom and give him his Master Rune of Wrath and Rune. He only costs 1400 and he's pretty solid. And he does have other options, like you can bring this Forge Fire if you have a heavily armored core. You can bring the Rune of Hearth and Home, which makes your units immune to psychology around him if you have low tier units. The Master Rune of Oath and Steel for 60 plus 60 armor can be decent in some matchups, like say against Skaven, where they can really shred your armor. And the Master Rune of Negation for the 44% damage resistance for 18 seconds can be decent. But really, this is what I would say is the most competitive sort of loadout. And if you are against a faction that has lots of range, you can give him the plus 20% missile resistance. So I would say the Rune Lord, and then the other most competitive Lord would be Ungrim Iron Fist. And the reason is because he is unbreakable, and if you strip him down with no abilities, he's actually very cheap, only 1350. He does have anti-large, armor piercing, and charge defense against large foes. So if you don't want to have abilities that you have to click on to make active, you can just send Ungrim up against pretty much anything and he will fight to the death and do quite well against a lot of units, even if they're just infantry units, and can lay a beat down on large units if he doesn't get knocked around. Now that's not to say all the other lords are bad. There are no bad choices here, no real weak choices. They're more situational, like the regular Dwarf Lord can be quite good. Belgar Ironhammer is very tanky. Grombrindle can be quite good, and he does magic damage, and he's a good duelist. He has armor piercing, and he has some very good abilities with his Flash Bomb, which is minus 27 melee defense, minus 76 speed. You know, and Thorgrim has some very nice buffs, which the High King is not that great, but for example, you can give him this Great Book of Grudges, and for 55 meters around him, all your units have plus 9 melee attack. But really your most competitive picks are your Rune Lord and Ungrim Iron Fist stripped down, and you can add to Ungrim as you want. Like his Deadly Onslaught on him is actually quite good, and Foe Seeker and Deathblow not really that great, and the Axe of Dargo is expensive but can be really good in the right matchup. So really your lords, there are no awful picks. There are some that are just less expensive. In multiplayer, you only have 12,400 gold to spend, so being frugal with your spend is really valuable, and your Rune Lord and Ungrim Iron Fist really do give you those options, though there are no bad picks. Now, for your heroes, the Rune Smith is probably your strongest overall hero to bring to your army, again, because he has that Rune of Wrath and Ruin. And that Rune of Wrath and Ruin, again, 150 meter range, it's strong against an infantry unit, and it does give them minus 48% speed. And you can get him pretty cheap on the field for 680 with just that. But he also has two other abilities here, and particularly Hammer of Carrick Draws, which is quite good. So if you're facing up against a faction that has very strong duelists or goon squads, you can cast that on one of them, and for 50 seconds they'll have minus 44 melee attack and minus 25% weapon damage. And he also does have the Master Rune of Groth One Eye, which is plus 8 leadership. The dwarfs have good leadership. This can be useful in certain situations. So at 832, you can bring him onto the field, and he's going to be quite good, and does have other abilities depending on the loadout you want. The Thane is also a solid choice. You can bring him on the field for 650, but really the ability that most people pick the Thane for is this Tormentor Sword. So when you cast it, anything within 26 or 30 meters of him can't move for 9 seconds and have minus 26 melee attack. And this ability, Master Rune of Stromney Redbeard, is also extremely good. Plus 5 melee attack and plus 4 leadership. It is pretty expensive, but you can get him on the field for 1039 and he will be very solid. The one hero pick which just doesn't really perform in multiplayer is the Master Engineer. Now there are some situations where the Master Engineer can be okay, but we've done lots of testing on him over the years, and really if you're going to try to play competitive, he's definitely one you should just leave home. So the next part, and probably the best part of the Dawi, are the infantry. The Dawi have very strong infantry all around, and really they have excellent top tier armor piercing infantry in these hammers. They're very strong armor piercing, have tons of weapon damage. They have very good melee attack. They have good armor, and they're pretty tanky. They're just very strong top tier armor piercing. They have really strong, heavily armored infantry all around, so their dwarf warriors are good low tier, their longbeards are just excellent mid tier, and the ironbreakers are really strong as well, and they have blasting charges. So they really have a great selection in this field, the best selection in the game for sure when it comes to heavily armored defensive infantry. Now, one of the things the dwarfs don't have in their infantry lineup is they don't have any low-tier anti-large or low-tier anti-large armor piercing like halberds or spearmen or these types of thing. Really, the Dawi's only anti-large option is the Slayer, and you know, they have a pretty good anti-large bonus. I mean, they're the only anti-large option, but they are very good. They're quite solid. They're unbreakable. You know, no matter what you send them at, they are pretty fast with a movement speed of 40. They have good melee attack and melee defense and good weapon strength. You know, they're very weak against other infantry, so you got to be careful, but they're good against all sorts of large units, and there are the Slayers, the giant Slayers, which are coming, which do have armor piercing. But that's the one area where the Dwarfs are a little bit shy on, is anti-large options from the infantry side. Now, the other great thing that Dowie have is they have very strong regiments of renown. Like the Ekron Miners in the right situation can be very good. They have 3 blasting charges. The Warriors of Dragonfire Past can be outstanding. They have anti-infantry. They do fire damage. They're pretty tanky. They got 50 melee defense. Very, very solid infantry. The Grumbling Guard are really outstanding, and basically because they're armor piercing and they have a leadership aura that helps your other units stay in the fight. And the big thing they have is the Old Grumblers, which is plus 9% vigor, and it goes off every 20 seconds or something like that, and lasts for 5 seconds and gives vigor to all your units, which is actually very important for the Dwarfs. So bringing the Grumbling Guard will never be a bad choice in any fight. The Dragonback Slayers are really, really strong. They are more expensive than the regular Slayers, obviously, but they do have this power of the Dragonback, which they have 22% flame resistance, and when they hit something, they cause them to be flammable, have a 22% weakness to fire damage, but the big thing they have is minus 36% speed. So when they hit something, it slows down, so they're really good against cavalry or units that are pretty quick. They can muck them up, and their 40% speed is often fast enough to stay on top of them. The last 2 units, the Norgrimling's Ironbreakers, are really strong. They are definitely worth the extra 300 gold compared to the regular Ironbreakers, but when you get really expensive units like this, they tend to be a little risky because they can be focused down, but these guys are just outstanding. And the same with the Peak Gate Guard. They're probably not as strong compared to the Hammers as the Norgrimling's Ironbreakers are compared to the regular Ironbreakers, but they are really, really good. And in the right situation, they can be outstanding because they do magic damage and they have armor sundering. So whatever they hit has minus 30 armor. So they can synergize with other units quite well, like even a Slayer or your Longbeards or this types of thing. So your Peak Gate Guard is very strong. There are some units that could use a buff, like the Miners and the Dwarf Warriors with great weapons and your Longbeards with great weapons, but in general, Dwarf Infantry is just solid. So when it comes to ranged units, the Dowie have the best lineup in the game. There's no doubt about it. The Missile Infantry is strong all across the board. There is no weaknesses. There's nothing you're wanting for nothing that anybody else has, and you even have some fairly cheap options in the Rangers, and you have great armor piercing in the Thunders and the Rangers with great weapons, although they have short range. You can even bring the Skalder Guard. They're just really solid. I would say the very best of the best in this lineup is the Bugman's Rangers, because they have charged defense against large foes, so they can defend your edges, and they have regeneration. They also have a little extra missile damage. And they have very good stats at 24 melee attack and 38 melee defense, so they can take a charge from Cav and survive it. But all around, they're good. These Iron Drakes at 700 can be amazing against some units, like Skaven or the Greenskins or these lower armored factions. And Iron Drakes with Trollhammer torpedoes with their anti-large armor piercing torpedoes can be amazing against Lizardmen or things, factions with big things. So the Missile Infantry, there's really no way to go really wrong with the Missile Infantry of the Dowie, with the exception of bringing too many and not being able to defend them. Because some of these guys are pretty squishy. The Rangers can be pretty squishy, and your Iron Drakes are very, very vulnerable if you let anything get into the back line. Same with your Rangers or your Uthar's Raiders. So you got to be a little bit careful, and there are a few little bugs in the games with the Thunderers right now. I would say that Quarrelers and Quarrelers with great weapons, though they are both really good, and I'm sure a lot of other factions would love to have a unit or units just like this, they are outperformed in general by Rangers, who are just a little bit cheaper, or Bugman's Rangers, so you don't see them on the field very much, but they're not bad. It's hard to go wrong with Dwarf Missile Infantry. They're just solid all around. Now, the next one is the Flying War Machines. Now, this is the Dowie's only flying options, and they are the Gyrocopters. Now all these Gyrocopters they're a unique unit. They are pretty good. Like the Gyrocopter, the basic Gyrocopter is anti-infantry. It's good for low armored targets. The Gyrocopter with brimstone guns are armor piercing, anti-large, and they do have the Gyro Bomber and the Skyhammer. I would say that Gyrocopters are a very high risk reward type of unit. In the right matchup, if your opponent doesn't bring units to deal with them, Gyrocopters are amazing. But Gyrocopters are very susceptible to other flyers. Even a unit like Fellbats or Carrion or these types of unit can muck up your Gyrocopters and make you have a really bad day. So they're very high risk reward. They have very low DPS, so damage per second on these guys is low, so they need a long time to operate, and as the battle gets longer and longer, your Gyrocopters will be more and more valuable. That said, their bombs have kind of a high DPS, especially against lower armored targets, so you drop your bombs at the right time, you can instantly rout things, because the unit you're dropping the bombs on get the debuff hit by artillery of -10 leadership, so your bombs can be outstanding at the right moments. But very, very micro intensive. I mean, if you're good at handling units and running around, making them go to the right things, and you got the right matchup, Gyrocopters can be amazing. Otherwise, they're a high risk reward type of unit, and definitely I would say for beginners, I would generally say stay away from them until you get better at controlling your army. Now when it comes to artillery, again, the Dowie have so much choice compared to everyone else. They have the best artillery lineup in the game. Empire has a pretty decent artillery lineup, but the Dowie's just better. And all across the board, there are no bad choices in this lineup. There's some very inexpensive bolt throwers that only have 340 range, but they're solid. They're good against infantry, good against large. You know, they don't have the highest damage. You know, your grudge thrower is really good, although it gets generally not picked very much because, you know, even though it's good, there are better choices in this lineup. Cannons are very strong, anti-large, armor piercing, and they have excellent range at 440. Your Goblobber is one of the units you see the most, and that's because it has that range of 440, and it also has Discourage, so when it hits a unit, it gives them -16 leadership, so it's quite strong, and it's a regiment renown, is pretty accurate. Organ guns can be absolutely crushing against armored infantry. You know, there's a bit of a bug on right now where some of your artillery aims for the edge of a unit as opposed for the middle, but organ guns can be unbelievably good in the right matchup. Same with flame cannons. Now, flame cannons say they're anti-infantry and they're do flame damage, but they also give them the debuff burnt for -8 leadership. They fire very quickly. They do have very short range at only 230, but they're good even against armored infantry. Now, it doesn't show that that shows their missile damage is 160 and their armor piercing is 75, but you put your flame cannon on a really heavily armored unit like Chosen, and the flame cannon will absolutely demolish them. You know, it's a very, very good unit, though it is very expensive. One of the things about artillery in general is they do lend themselves to the dwarf style of defensive gameplay. Like they're really, you deploy and your enemy has to come to you if you have the artillery advantage, or else you can just shoot them down until they're dead. But they must be protected. You know, none of these units can take charges or take breath attacks and these types of things, so you really do have to protect your artillery. So usually you have to be careful about how many you bring. You know, often one cannon is enough, or just one Goblobber is enough in a build to be quite strong and to do everything you want it to do. So it's not always really needed to bring more than one, but you know, you can bring 2 or 3 pretty reliably and do okay. Getting above 3 would be generally a bad choice unless you're kind of going for cheap bolt throwers. I've brought as many as 5 in a battle and they've done well, but I would say 1 to 3 is pretty good, and you can definitely have very successful dwarf builds with no artillery at all. So that's really the artillery. The other thing about artillery is chevrons make a big difference on artillery. So if you bring a cannon and you rank them up, each rank does make a big difference, because not only does it affect things you would expect, like, you know, their melee attack, melee defense, and leadership, which don't really matter for artillery. It affects their damage because they fire faster and they're much more accurate. And that can make a big difference. You know, if you have extra money at the end of your build, putting chevrons into your artillery is never a bad choice. The cannons can be really strong with that extra, that extra accuracy specifically. So that is sort of the basics of the dwarf army. Now I'll do a few multiplayer notes and just go over some build concepts. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Clan Angrand. So Clan Angrand is basically the same. It doesn't quite have the same lord choice, but they do have these ethereal units. So two ethereal thanes, one runesmith, and one master engineer. Now these do have a bit of unique gameplay because they have 75% physical resistance and they cause fear and terror. So in the right matchup, like against greenskins, even beastmen, they can be really, really good, but they can be vulnerable because other factions that have death magic with spirit leech can absolutely obliterate these guys. But you know, this is definitely an option if you want to have some fear and terror, because that's something that the Dawi just don't have, units that cause fear and terror. So that is definitely an option. Now when it comes to multiplayer, some things that you have to know as a new player, I think, are be prepared to fight the Beastmen, Chaos, and Dark Elves. These are three factions that tend to do really, really well against the Dawi. So the Dark Elves, the Beastmen, and Chaos. So you're going to see them quite a bit. So it's always a good idea to have an army ready for those three factions and to slowly build them up over time. You know, you can just pick whatever you want, but if you're in multiplayer, you know, you can make an army. You know, you want to, let's just auto-gen an army, and you can just save that army setup to whatever you want, and then when you want to load it, you can go ahead and, you know, pick your army to load. So away you go. Oops, that's actually saving it. I want to load an army, so I can go ahead and pick an army, and away I go. I've got an army that I've selected. It's all saved in there, and it's easy to pick really quickly. Now that's a Beastman army I was using for a recent tournament, but that's the kind of nice thing. So I would definitely highly recommend, if you're going to play the Dwarfs, spend some time thinking about your armies. Save your army as versus Beastmen, versus Chaos, and versus Dark Elves, and you'll give yourselves a little bit more time, because you're going to see those factions more than most, because people know they're good against the Dwarfs and they will counterpick into them. The Dwarfs have some really fun synergies if you play around with them. You know, like if you get Warriors of Dragonfire Pass, they synergize with the Dragonback Slayers, they synergize with the Iron Drakes who do flame damage. Like these guys have you know, they cause flame damage. These guys make things weak to flame damage. You know, they're you know, it's just some good fun synergies that can be had, and you don't always have to just have infantry. Like I know there's good synergies between having a dwarf warrior in the line and having behind that dwarf warrior a bolt thrower. So, you know, think of those as two units. So there are definitely some good fun synergies. With the dwarfs also, terrain matters. So when you're getting ready to fight, always take a look at the map, because heavily forested maps with lots of hills can give your artillery line of sight problems, and you might want to adjust your army a little bit based on the map. I would say terrain matters more to the dwarfs than to any other faction, because they don't have the mobility to get to where they need to go. So you may have to change your army. Instead of having organ guns that have a very low arc of fire on a hilly map, you might want to bring a Goblobber that has a high arc of fire. Same with Thunders versus Rangers or Quarrelers. So you have to pay special attention to the terrain when you're playing the Dwarfs, extra special attention to the terrain. Now, I'll go over, that's pretty much the review. That's what the Dwarfs are like. That's how they play. I'll go over a few units that I think anyone who's starting out can bring these units as a base or a foundation, and any matchup, you can't go wrong with these units. So a unit that is very, very safe is the Rune Lord, again with his Anvil of Doom and the Master Rune of Wrath and Rune at 1262, pretty cheap. But if you're not going to be good at targeting your spells, you're very new to the game, you're worried about if you don't get off these Runes of Wrath and Rune, that they kind of go to waste. So really a very safe pick is just to bring Ungrim Iron Fist, strip him down so he has no abilities, and he's only 1350 and he can lead your army. He has anti-large, armor piercing, he can fight lots of things, and he's just point and click. You point him at something, click it, and he will go and try and kill it. He's very, very good. Now, until you're better at heroes, I would be careful about bringing them. They're again, Thane and Runesmith are strong, but they're not as easy to control because they have to be in the right place and you have to think about them. You don't have to worry about Ungrim being anywhere to buff anyone or anything like that. The infantry units that I think are always a must-have is, 2 Longbeards. In competitive play, there's not going to be any matchup you're ever going to have where you only brought 2 Longbeards and you thought after the matchup, I wish I wouldn't have brought Longbeards. They have old Grumblers, so what they do is they can encourage nearby units to help them stay on the field. They have great stats, a very nice spot in the stat line. They're just a good solid unit, so 2 Longbeards will never ever be a bad choice when in any matchup that I can actually think of. The Grumbling Guard, again, is going to be hard to think of a match where you're going to say, I wish I didn't have the Grumbling Guard. Now, you can build your armies any way you want. I'm just giving a kind of a base, but Grumbling Guard are very good in all sorts of matchups, and same with the Dragonback Slayers. Now, you can build out your infantry loadout depending on how you want, but these 4 as a kind of a base, your Dragonback Slayers for backline, for cavalry, for flanking, for slowing things down, your Grumbling Guard for the Vigor, Aura, Armor Piercing, and a couple of Longbeards in there somewhere, will make the base good foundation for any army against any faction. Obviously as you learn the game, you'll tweak your picks and everything, but this is a very, very good foundation. Now when it comes to ranged, you have lots of choices, but the one choice that's always going to perform is you're very rarely going to leave a battle saying, I wish I didn't bring Bugman's Rangers. So 2 Bugman's Rangers are going to be very good in almost every matchup. They are a good unit to bring as a sort of a foundational unit. And, from there, go and pick what you want to pick. If you wanted to have artillery, the Goblobber is just a really strong pick all around. It has good leadership. It does cause discouraged, and it has very good ranged. But I would say Dowie armies with or without artillery can be good, and this would be the foundation for any army. And you can start building that out quite nicely. Like say you could bring the Goblobber, you bring a couple of Dwarf Warriors, maybe you bring your Norgrimling's Ironbreakers for that beefy middle, and a couple of hammers, for some good armor piercing, and you're starting to get a sort of a nice set of units. This is sort of a nice sort of rounded build out, and you still have 600 gold left. Maybe you bring another Longbeard. You can bring another Dwarf Warrior or something, or you even bring a Quarreler, but you can bring another Dwarf Warrior and just grab these guys, give them a chevron. See if I can give them something like that. Yeah, so we'll just grab these guys, give them one chevron, give these guys a chevron, and you got 23 gold left over. I don't know if we can get that 22. There you go. So that's kind of a very basic dwarf army. It's going to do good in a lot of situations. Again, the core of that army is the units that I mentioned. We're bringing the Norgrimling's Ironbreakers, a couple of armor piercing. We have Dragonback Slayers. We do have good artillery, good edge defense with the Bugman's Rangers, some decent frontline infantry. This type of lineup is going to do good against a lot of builds and against a lot of opponents. And especially when you're new, something like this is pretty easy to manage, in that if you forget about your Bugman's Rangers and they get charged, not such a big deal. They have charged defense against large and they regenerate. You know, if you... One artillery is fairly easy to defend because you have your Dragonback Slayers. You know, you can put a unit of Dwarf Warriors back there, and you have enough armor piercing to do pretty good. You know, your Dwarf Warriors can handle chaff infantry. Ungrim Iron Fist is going to do good. You know, your Nordgremlings Ironbreakers have blasting charges and are incredibly robust. Something like this is as a foundation is going to do pretty good for you. But really the core of any build as you're starting out, I would say, are these units here. You start with those units and then build the rest of your army around there. You're never going to go too far wrong because you have a pretty good core. So that's my Dowie dwarf perspective on the dwarfs, a faction review, something meant for beginners, new players who want to try multiplayer but you know, want to ease their way into it. And you can do that by bringing armies that are, you know, kind of allow you to punch above your weight, armies that have a very good mix of units that are going to do well. And this would be a great foundation for a new player to excel. You have nothing you got to click. You know, you except for your units. You know, you click on Ungrim Iron Fist and you make them go attack. You know, you tell your units where to attack and they're going to do pretty well for you. So I'll keep this updated over time. This is April 2018. We have some updates coming up with the new Giant Slayers, and I will try and sort of every once in a while revisit this so that I can give a bit of a resource to new players that are considering multiplayer but are worried about just getting crushed over and over and over again. The Dowie, though they don't have all the options that other factions do, they do lend themselves to new players because they're easy to play. They have a very clear play style. You don't have to worry about cav over in 10 different directions and making sure you're running your magic and everything else like that. They're quite a simple army to play, and they're quite enjoyable. You know, you you know, your units have really good leadership, so you can send them into the battle and just let them go. It's kind of fire and forget, and they will do their job, you know, as the Dowie. So hope you found that interesting. Love to hear comments down below if you've just started the Dowie and just started playing a little multiplayer. I'd love to hear your experiences or units that you found that have served you well in your battles. And if you do use this basic foundation of Ungrim with the Bugman's Rangers, Dragonback Slayers, you know, Grumbling Guard and a couple Longbeards, or the basic army that I put out, and you find that you like them, or you find that it can be improved, or you don't like some units or something, definitely want to hear comments. I always love comments, and it can help me make this better in the future. So, you know, a lot of people who are just starting the game often don't realize how much value they can add to helping other people learn the game, because you only get to go through that experience of learning it for the first time once. And you have a very unique perspective while you're learning multiplayer and while you're experiencing these units in multiplayer for the first time. So I would love for you to comment down below and share that experience with me so that I can share it with other people in the future and help make a beginner's experience that much better. So hope you found it interesting. Looking forward to the comments, and I will see you soon.